Eventually, after all that went to they found
All right, so let's go ahead and get started here. It's Friday. This is you. You've made it this far. Well, looks like some of you have made it this far. I'm not sure what's happening with the rest. Okay, it's been a long week, I suppose. All right, so I'm going to start with a story. It was 1929, October 29th. This is the date of the New York Stock Exchange stock market crash, which many historians, Rothbard being an exception, would mark as the beginning of the Great Depression. Right. Roughly 2 weeks later, November 13th, 40 Wall Street, at the time that the tallest building that had been built, is completed. And it stays, right, the tallest building for a matter of about 6 months. Then, May 1930, the Chrysler Building is completed and is the tallest building in the world for less than a year. And April 1931, the Empire State Building opens. It's an interesting thing. We have this completion of 3 significant buildings all right around the time, right, of the stock market crash. So is this something that's just an accident, right? History may be filled with accidents, or is there some pattern to this? Right, so this was something that was proposed in 1999 by Andrew Lawrence. They called it the Skyscraper Index. Right, so what he observed was this was not just kind of a one-off, right, type of event, but this is a pattern that we see repeating time and time again, right, throughout the 20th century and into the 21st. Right, so we have the Singer Building being completed right around the time of the Panic of 1907. Then we have 40 Wall Street, the Chrysler Building, Empire State Building, right around the onset of the Great Depression. We also have the World Trade Center and what is now the Willis Tower, originally was called the Sears Tower, opening right around the time of the oil shock. Coming to the late 1990s, you have the Asian financial crisis right around the same time the Petronas Towers open, and then the Burj Khalifa Tower helps usher in, right, the global financial crisis in 2008 or so. So one after another, right, we're seeing this pattern, right? So Andrew Lawrence's background, he was just kind of a property analyst, right? And he observed this, and it was really up to, I think, our own Mark Thornton here at the Mises Institute, who you've heard, you're going to hear later today as well, to connect this phenomenon, right, to Austrian business cycle theory. So this is not just some kind of weird accident or psychological thing. It is, in fact, exactly what we might predict, right, based on some traits of Austrian business cycle theory. Right, so if you want to see some of Mark Thornton's insights, here's the book here, right, The Skyscraper Curse. So his original article appeared in 2005, right, and he has a lot more that he's built on this, right, over the past 20 years or so. And so what he did in this paper in 2005 was first he kind of laid out some of the history and connecting the kinds of things we saw in the previous slide. So we have things like the Singer Building and the MetLife Building, completed also right around that Panic of 1907. We have the 3 that I mentioned before, right, and the onset of the Great Depression. Right? And what he identified was we had a regular pattern. Now, with one exception. That was 1913, the Woolworth building was built, and that was the tallest building at that point in time. This seemed to be a false positive. It suggests, oh, we're going to head toward a financial crisis, and there was not one. Though Thornton does suggest this might be that the crisis got covered up by World War I spending, right? So it's very difficult for us to identify this would happen. We also know this is something that we see also on smaller scales. For example, it was several years ago, I think my wife and I had been married maybe 2 or 3 years. We took a trip to Pittsburgh, and we took this riverboat cruise. I had dinner right on the Gateway Clipper. Right? And as part of this, they kind of gave a tour of the city as you're going down the 3 rivers that are in downtown Pittsburgh. And they would talk about the different buildings. And I, of course, being me, and having heard Thornton talk about the skyscraper curse, saying, oh, this building was built in 1930. This building opened 1932. This building 1931. Like, oh, really? So it's not just the Empire State Building, but we also have these local clusters, sort of skyscrapers being built right around that same time. Right? So why would this happen? What is the theoretical connection between skyscrapers and Austrian business cycle theory? Well, Thornton lays out for us 3 different Cantillon effects, right, that all would lead toward skyscrapers being built. And so I want to spend probably most of my time talking about the first one, and that is that lower interest rates tend toward higher land prices. And I think that this one is the reason that I'm the one giving the talk, because I read Thornton's paper and then got some ideas about how it might connect to other ideas within economics and wrote another paper that has never been published. Actually, if you want to know about this paper I wrote, the best place to read about it, this book, right around page 95, he picks up talking about this paper. That's the most complete version of the paper is actually in Thornton's book. He's the one that wrote that. But in any case, right, so let's flesh this out. So lower interest rates lead to higher land prices. So there are a few ways we can explain this. So kind of a traditional way would be to point out, right, that land offers a stream of services over the time of its existence. Right, and it turns out land exists for an extremely long time. Right? So you can use this land year after year, century after century, millennium after millennium. Right? And so it's a very long period that is going to offer services for us. Of course, we know then we discount the future, right, based on the rate of discount, the interest rate. Right? So when we look at the actual land price, what that captures is all of these services discounted, right, by the interest rate. Now, if the interest rate falls, as happens in the early stages of the Austrian business cycle, as the interest rate falls, we discount less. That's going to drive up land prices. We just have less discounting. That alone is enough to drive up land prices. So I suggested, okay, that makes sense. But I think we can go a little bit further. Right? And focusing not just on land on the whole, right, but specifically the downtown land where skyscrapers are built. Right? So in order to do this, my idea was to combine, right, this insight from Thornton with what we call bid-rent theory. So let me lay out bid-rent theory here. So I want you to imagine for a second here, so I'll explain this triangle. This is not Hayekian or anything like that. So the idea here is that we have some kind of city center. And the city center is where the main office buildings, say, retail areas and the like, where a lot of the life of the city happens, right, is in the center. And what we're imagining is how people decide where they're going to live, right, residentially, relative to that center. Right, so the idea is we're going to have something like this. So the bid rent is the idea of how much are you willing to pay for a particular plot of land based on how close you are to the city center. So the left side of the graph indicates you're very close to the city center. The far side to the right would be you're further from the city center. So the claim is that you're going to be willing to pay more to live closer to the city center for a simple reason. I have to commute to work every day. And the commute is costly to me. It takes time, I have to burn gasoline, all of these kinds of things, wear and tear on my vehicle, right? So I would rather live closer to work, right? The office is downtown, right? So I want to live close to downtown. I'm willing to pay more, right, to live close to downtown and avoid, right, those commuting costs. Now, on the other hand, that doesn't mean I'm totally unwilling to live further away. Just, it would have to be cheaper. It would have to justify, right, the additional commuting cost for me to live further away. So we end up then with what we call the bid-rent function, which has this type of pattern. So you're very close to the city center on the left side, we'll see very high bid rents, and then we get further from the city center to the right, we have lower bid rents. Now this would be reflected then in the price of land. So I'm willing to pay more to live close to the city center. That's going to bid up the price of land relative close to the city center relative to further away. So a natural thing for us to do then is try to economize on the use of land. So rather than building in such a way we're using large plots of land, right, in order to, say, build housing or what have you, we're going to try to use much less land and build up, right, rather than out. And so this would suggest what we should see when we look at cities is that toward the city center, we'll see very tall buildings. We're going to see very dense development. We won't see, say, a lot of, say, large yards or something like that close to the middle of a town. Instead, we will see those things much further out where land is relatively cheap. Right? At that point, we can economize less, right, on the use of land. Right? We can have the larger yards and what have you. So one way we can see this visually is actually through looking at skylines. Now, this is something that's kind of tricky because it turns out like this works really, really well if I just assume that the world is just kind of this flat plain where there are no mountains, there are no rivers that might attract us or push us away from certain areas. So this doesn't work, say, as well for a city like Pittsburgh, which kind of sits down inside of a valley and is very bound by rivers and mountains. But if you find areas that are in relatively flat areas, we can see things like this. So there's the Houston skyline. Right? So you can see right downtown, right, we have the tallest buildings. And as we move further away from downtown, we do see this gradual decline in the height of buildings. Right? So you can basically draw these lines up here, and it follows the height of buildings fairly closely. Right? Or if not Houston, right, Atlanta, which many of us have traveled through here in the past week, follows the same kind of pattern. And you have to move pretty far away from Atlanta because it's kind of a sprawly city, but you can see that same general pattern, right? A peak in the center and then gradually declining as you go toward the edges. Now, this pattern also appears even in cities like, say, Auburn that don't really have a skyline per se. Nonetheless, we can see the denser, higher development as you move closer toward downtown, right? So I pulled this up as a satellite image. The center of this is Toomer's Corner right there, so the corner of Magnolia and College. And what I want to point out here is that you see a lot of gray, right, indicating these are the tops of buildings, parking lots, that kind of thing. Right, we are building very densely. You don't see a lot of, say, green space, right, as we are toward downtown. On the other hand, if I zoom out a little bit, so we still have downtown in the center here where you see a lot of gray, but as you move further out, we do see more green space. So especially if you go down here toward the lower right, which would be the southeast, that's where we start seeing a lot more of, say, the high income, low density residential areas, large yards, lots of trees in people's yards, that kind of thing. Right? You don't see that downtown, you see it a bit away from downtown, right? Which is exactly what would be consistent with things like the bid rent function and needing to economize, right, that downtown space because the land is more expensive there. You can also see this other places where you might have to take some of the natural geography into account. My family will often vacation in Virginia Beach, Virginia. And it follows the same kind of pattern you see in many coastal towns where the most expensive land is going to be the beachfront because it offers special services that you don't get elsewhere. And where do you find the tallest buildings? Right on the beachfront. Everything is really, really tall. And even it's to the point where in that particular city of Virginia Beach, it's Atlantic. Atlantic is the name of the road that runs along, right, the beachfront. One side of the road, it's these enormous buildings, 20 or more stories. The other side, it's much, much smaller hotels. It's interesting, right, to see this kind of extreme case that you can see there. Okay. Now, So I pulled this up, and I get excited about weird things. This is probably not a surprise. I mean, I'm here in the room. I suspect this is a trait that many of us share. I get excited about weird things. So I looked at this satellite image, and I looked a little bit closer at one part of it. I'm like, oh, this is fantastic. And I actually said this out loud, and my wife was like, what are you talking about? Oh, this is great, because it turns out this map's a little bit old, right? This is not actually a current satellite image. And the way that I knew that was I zoomed in on a building that has been very important to, I suspect, the grand majority of us in this room over the past week, the Auburn University Hotel. Right, so what I have here, this slice over to the left, right, toward the center of that is where the hotel is, right? So this building here, right, would be the hotel, right? There it is. Right? And then I saw, right, a couple other things that are no longer there. Right? So if you go to the north of the hotel, this is showing a significant parking lot up here. That's not a parking lot anymore. That's now the Heyday Market. is there. And actually you can see, you probably can't read it, but one of these pins here, I think it's this one right there, is actually says Heyday Market, but then from the satellite image it looks like a parking lot because it's new enough, they hadn't updated the satellite image. Another thing, here I get to talk like an old person. Right, so I remember back in the day, right, when this parking lot was there. Right? It was a nice big parking lot just south of the hotel. It's not there anymore. That's where the parking deck is now. That's a great example of where we're going from building out. Parking lots are relatively cheap to build. You're just kind of laying down asphalt on the ground. Right? So you're not going to build up unless the land itself gets really expensive. Right? Then you want to start building further up, right? Economize on that use of land. And that's what we've seen happen. And this is kind of a natural process we'd expect to happen, right, in a developing city. Right? As a city gathers more people, you're going to find that bid rent function from several slides ago. It's going to start lifting, which does two things. Right? One, the rent per land goes up, which means we start economizing on land more, especially toward the center of town. But another thing that happens, here, I will go back. Another thing that happens as we raise this line is that we start moving further and further out to the right. Right? So that would be the phenomenon of sprawl that we see. Right? So where we hit 0 here, anybody over to the right of that says, well, it's not worth being part of the city. It's just too far away. Right? But if the function goes up, right, so we have a higher line here, then these areas that were previously sub-marginal in terms of being connected with the city now become worthwhile to be connected with the city. Okay. So this is something we will often see in just kind of the regular process of development. Right, so what happens, though, when we go outside of the regular process of development, have an Austrian business cycle? I suggest that there are a couple things that are going to affect this bid rent function in two ways. Right, so first, as we have this monetary expansion, the lowering of interest rates, well, one effect we'll get is that there will be a rise in people's incomes. So people's incomes go up, right? Now I have more money to devote toward things like paying for housing, right? Paying for the land the housing sits on. So we should see an increase, right, in that bid rent function based on that. And this is the same as when we have the natural process of development. That looks very similar. But another thing happens, and here we need to pull in some of Murray Rothbard's theory of how wages are determined, specifically the demand for labor. So what Rothbard observes, right, is that when we pour labor into a productive process, we don't get the actual product of it until later. Right, which means, right, the capitalist then, right, that is fronting the money up front, is going to discount, right, that future revenue, right, that it comes from the labor that is being hired. So we're going to discount that by the rate of discount, and that will determine what the demand for labor looks like. Which means then, right, if the interest rate falls, right, we discount that less. It's going to increase the demand for labor and thereby increase wages. Right? So this increase in wage has another effect, right, apart from just higher incomes. And that it changes what my opportunity cost is when I'm commuting. So I think about, right, the value of my time, and we have some reasonable evidence that people do kind of think this way. We think of the value of our time as being connected with the wages we could earn with that time. So the higher wages go, the more protective I become of my time. So what does that mean, right? So when I start thinking about commuting times, right, if my wage is higher, I really want to make sure I don't have to commute too far. So it's not just a total raising in the bid rent function, but also a steepening of the bid rent function. Because I want to move really close to downtown so I don't have as long of a commute. Right, so this means we can have two possibilities. This is the one that I'm going to talk about second, because it's the more complicated one. But we'll talk about the first one first. So the first one would be a simple, just we have a total increase, right, along the entire bid rent function. So the whole thing is higher, just steeper. So in that case, we would see higher building in the downtown areas as we see a big increase in land prices there. We'd also see the size of the city geographically grow as we'd see additional suburbs being built and the like, so urban sprawl. But it's also perfectly possible we could have a case like this, where we have two things happening at once. On the one hand, we have the general increase in the bid rent function from our higher incomes, but at the same time, we have the steepening of it. So when we're looking at downtown, right, where skyscrapers would be built, right, we still have really, really high land prices, right, that is going to encourage us to build skyscrapers there. Right? But things look a little bit different when we get toward the outskirts. Right? So here we actually, the way that I've drawn this one, we actually have a collapse, right, in the geographic size of the city. Right? So these areas off here to the right that previously was worthwhile to be connected to the city here, but now it no longer is. The commute's just too long, right? So we're not going to do it. So this could look a couple ways, right? So one might be an actual emptying of the suburbs, that people just abandon the outside and move toward the center. That can happen. Although I think that in kind of my just casual observations, I don't think that's the thing that happens more often, at least in cities that are generally stable or growing. Instead, what we tend to see is a decoupling of downtown from the suburbs. Right? So we start seeing people who live right further away from downtown, they just don't go downtown anymore. Right? So instead we see, say, suburban shopping malls start appearing. Right? So I don't have to go downtown to shop, I have the shopping mall next door. Right? Or we see office parks appearing on the outskirts of the town, right? Rather than everybody having to go downtown to work. Right? So we see this type of thing happening. So it's not that all of the buildings that were in this area become abandoned, no, that they just are no longer connected with this particular city center. When I think about my own life, I can definitely observe this. Like where I live, I'm between two kind of small to medium-sized cities, Canton, Ohio, and Akron, Ohio. I'm almost exactly halfway between the two. Right? And I almost never go to either of them. I have plenty of restaurants I can go to that are a little bit closer, right, to where I live. It turns out where I work is not actually in either downtown. Our campus is a little bit outside of downtown Canton, is actually near one of the shopping areas, right? So we have building that is occurring not so much in downtown. Downtown is not looking quite as exciting. Right? People have reoriented their lives away from, right, the downtown areas, which would be perfectly consistent with this type of thing. All right, so how does this then lead to the skyscraper curse over the course of the business cycle? Well, skyscrapers aren't going to be out here. They're not going to be building a skyscraper in my suburb. Skyscrapers are still going to be downtown. In downtown, we see the pattern that it is exactly right what Thornton said, right, that we're going to see higher land prices as a result, right, of the lower interest rates. And we see that especially downtown. Right, so it's not just that higher land prices in general are leading to skyscrapers, but the higher land prices are concentrated in those areas that make it even more likely that we're going to get those skyscrapers. Okay. All right, so the next effect, it would also lead toward the building of skyscrapers that Dr. Thornton talks about, right, is this lower interest rate tends to increase the size of firms by encouraging greater capital intensity. Right, so when you decrease interest rates, suddenly the various capital goods become more attractive as a way to produce. So we end up using more of these, and that ends up often being connected with things like economies of scale, and it makes sense for us to build up, right, larger firms. So when we have a larger firm, what does that mean? Well, it means we have to have larger management to manage this firm. We need some place to put all of this management, so we're going to need a larger building, right, to put everybody in. Right, so we have higher land prices and the increase in firm size, right, creating then this demand, right, for us to have taller buildings downtown and larger buildings downtown. A third effect that he points out, right, is that the lower interest rate tends to encourage additional research and development, which can then be used, right, to build taller buildings. This is a point where sometimes the way that we describe the capital structure, we end up missing one of the early stages of development. So I think a lot of the time we come to it with this mindset of how manufacturing works in time. So first thing we have to do is we have to mine the iron out of the ground, right? Then we need to take all of this iron and whatever other raw materials, we take those to the plant and we transform them into some other good, and then we transport it from there to the wholesalers, right, who then organize the ultimate retail process and then transfer to the retailers, and the consumer ends up with it. But this is missing a very important stage of production that often happens even before the raw material stage. Right? That's research and development. We have to know what we're going to be making, right, in the first place, and research and development is often a part of making it possible, right, for us to make the thing that we are going to be producing. And so that is something where lower interest rates tend to encourage, right, these early stages of production, and that tends to include research and development. Right, so this is something where building skyscrapers, we can think of kind of two possible things that limit the height of the skyscraper. Right, so one would be kind of the financial side. Right? Like, does it actually make sense, right, for us to build really, really tall? Right? So what are the things that make it make sense? Expensive land downtown, right, and needing lots of space. Right? We've already in the previous two cases, these elements, right, the higher land prices, especially downtown and larger firms, shown that, yes, that we're going to see these, right, in the early stages of the business cycle, and that will play out. The research and development side kinds of frees up the engineering problem. Because it might be, yes, I'd love to build this enormous tower to the moon, right? But if it's not practically possible based on the technology we have, it's not going to happen. Right? So we need to find a way around this in terms of engineering, and research and development loosens up those requirements. So even simple things like, how do I get to the top of this tower? Walking the stairs of the Empire State Building does not sound attractive to me. Let alone the Burj Khalifa Tower. Right? Walking the steps all the way up, I'm not going to do that. Right? But building an elevator that can actually get you there is not an easy task. That is something that requires a great deal of engineering, developing often totally new systems, right, to make it possible, right, for you to actually move people in a reasonable way further up the tower. And so this research and development then frees up the ability, right, for us to build taller. So it's really for these three reasons, right? We have these three effects that Thornton points out: higher land prices, larger firms, research and development that makes it all possible. Right? Then we would expect to see, right, skyscrapers would show up over the course of a business cycle. Right? So now let's get a little bit into some of the debate. So Thornton publishes his paper, right? And it does get some response, in particular from a trio of economists, right? Jason Barr being the one that kind of leads this. A lot of his research is in skyscrapers, right? So this kind of catches his attention, right, this idea. So he, along with two co-authors, I believe it's Bruce Mizrak, I believe is his name, and I forget the first name of Mundra. Right, so the three of them published a paper in 2014 in the journal Applied Economics. The title of this is Skyscraper Height in the Business Cycle, Separating Myth from Reality. Okay. Now, you might be able to get a hint, their view of the skyscraper curse. Okay. Let's give the details just so you know. So they do three different types of tests, right, to try to figure out, is there a connection, right, between the business cycle and skyscraper height? Right? Is there a skyscraper curse? Right? Now, I'm going to lay out all of the results and then tell you their interpretation. If you think that doesn't quite make sense, you're on the right page. Okay. All right. So one thing they look at first, say, okay, let's look at all of these record-setting buildings and what their announcement dates were, what their opening dates were, and then how does that connect, say, to the nearest peak? Or do we see some kind of pattern there? And the statistical analysis that they did, they said, oh no, we don't see a pattern here. Now I will say, I was just reviewing their paper this week in preparation for this talk. I looked at their table, I'm like, I know a good optometrist. They might need to have their eyes examined if they don't see some kind of pattern here, but I'll talk about that in a minute. All right. So no, there's no pattern here, right? Nothing like, right, where we have big buildings being built and then, right, a collapse. Okay. All right. Another test they did is called a Granger causality test. So the Granger causality test, the design of that is it's trying to establish the timing of things. So does one thing reliably come before another thing? Right? So they did Granger causality tests on output as measured by gross domestic product and the average height of buildings that are being built. And what they found was that the average height of buildings being built did not Granger cause output changes. In other words, as we're building higher and higher, we cannot predict that, at least cannot reliably predict that GDP is going to be going up in the future based on that. Of course, that's not the claim we make, but okay. All right, fine. Now they did find that the opposite, right, did work, that as GDP went up, right, that would predict that we would see higher buildings being built after that. Okay, this is interesting. And the last test they did was a co-integration test. So the purpose of this test is to determine whether your two data series have some kind of common trend. Right? Do they seem to move together? And they did find good evidence that height and output are in fact co-integrated. They do seem to move together over time. Okay? And the conclusion they reach from this is that clearly there is no skyscraper curse. All right. I'll leave it at that. No, we didn't leave it at that. No, it's okay. So the next year, 2015, right, Dr. Thornton, along with two co-authors, Elizabeth Boyle and somebody named Lucas Engelhardt, wrote a response, right, to this paper. The title is there such a thing as a skyscraper curse? Right? Now, obviously, we just kind of accepted their results and said, well, no, there's not. No, they were clearly incorrect, both in their interpretation of their own results, right? And not to mention the statistical work they did wouldn't really test, right, the skyscraper curse. Right, so let's go into some of this. So the first thing we did in this was kind of reinterpret, right, the results that they gave, and just point out that this is actually perfectly consistent with what we'd expect from the skyscraper curse. So even down to that first, right, very simple test they did, here are all of the record-setting buildings, here's the timing to the next peak, or no, it's the closest peak, not necessarily the next one. Right, so I went looking at that this week, right, and what we found, they had 14, right, buildings they looked at in their list. Right. Of those, right, 7 of them, right, had a pattern where they were announced when the economy was in a boom, right, and completed when the economy was in a downfall. Which means half the time we're finding the skyscraper is completing somewhere around, right, when the peak has to have happened. Yet somehow their statistical tests do not find this. Right? Now, the other half the time, we do have a couple cases where it went kind of the other direction, right? And then 5 where you just stayed in the same stage of the cycle. Right? So it might be something along the lines of, we started building, and then we finished building, and then those of us that say the skyscraper curse is real say, oh, okay, they finished just a little too early, and then we see the collapse following. And that does, in fact, follow if you look at the dates. Right? Or maybe sometimes what happens is they end up planning things during the boom stage, but then they don't manage to get the announcement out until you're right around the peak or just after, and they're not going to give up immediately, or at least not always. Okay? Right? So you do have these other 7 cases, but the question we need to ask is, so we have half of these cases, right? We capture the peak, right, between the announcement and the opening date, or the completion date. Right? Like, is this normal? Right? Is this something that would just happen randomly? Right? Would we just by chance, with the time period there, would just by chance happen to catch peaks half the time? If so, then okay, maybe this is just random. We answer that question in our paper. I'll get to it in a minute. Okay. All right. The other point, so this point about the Granger causality. So one point about this is that one thing that is a limitation of Granger causality tests, right, is that they're stuck looking at some kind of linear relationship. Right, so where it's a consistent pattern of higher and higher or lower and lower. Right? We're always predicting things are going to be higher or lower in the next period. But the skyscraper curse doesn't do this. Right? It's perfectly consistent with us saying, yeah, we would expect over the course of the upswing for buildings to get taller. This is perfectly fine, right? But eventually things are going to flip the other way, right? Once we hit that peak, right, then we're going to start predicting a downfall. So we would sometimes predict the increase in the early stages, but then as we approach that peak, we would start predicting a downfall, right? This is not going to be able to be captured by any kind of Granger causality test, which doesn't allow, right, for this kind of more complex relationship, the kind of pattern that we can predict, right, using what we call pattern prediction, right? You can't capture that if you're just assuming linear relationships. In terms of interpretation, I actually find their co-integration test the strangest, right? So height and output are co-integrated, right, which means they're basically moving the same way, or if you kind of graph them out, they're more or less parallel lines. Now, what does that imply about the peak of height and the peak of output? They would happen around the same time, which is what the skyscraper curse says, right? We'll reach the peak right around the time the crisis hits, that is. So the peak of the skyscraper, the peak of the business cycle should happen right around the same time. Right? So the result from Barmeister and Minder is totally consistent, right, with what the skyscraper curse would tell us. Now, we did also add some kind of new empirical results, dealing with that question of, okay, could it have just been chance, right, those 7 cases out of the 14? Right, so I just did some quick statistical analysis. This is nothing particularly complicated. It's the kind of analysis you can do with kind of that first level of statistics, where I just looked at, like, what were the odds of us having a recession in the United States in a particular month, given that there had been a skyscraper, like one of the record-setting skyscrapers in the previous year, so over the previous 12 months. And then compared that to what is the probability of us being in a recession in the United States, right, if there was no skyscraper built in those previous 12 months. So what's the difference? Well, the probability of a recession in the United States, given a skyscraper in that previous 12 months on the calendar, was 56.25%. Right? So over half the time, right, this works with that kind of precision, right? And now if we widen it out a little bit you can get better than this. But even just within 12 months, using that line, 56.25%. How does that compare to if there is not a skyscraper? Without the skyscraper, it's 23.07%. So we see over a doubling of the odds of ending up in a recession if there's a skyscraper the past year and being completed. Yet somehow, we don't see this, right? And you can do all of the statistical significance tests you wish on this. It is a statistically significant difference. And not only statistically significant, but I think we can agree that the difference between less than a quarter chance and more than a half chance is practically significant, right? Like this is between I shouldn't be predicting a recession happening and I should be predicting a recession happening. I also did some kind of basic regression stuff, trying to look at these recession odds, trying to take into account the fact that there's a certain amount of, I guess you would say, momentum, right, in the economy. So recessions tend to stay that way, right? Booms tend to stay that way. So we can account for that some with regression analysis, and we still find the same result, right? That even if we control for that, there's an increase in the odds of a recession if a skyscraper was completed within that previous year. Okay, right, so we find positive evidence in favor of there being a skyscraper curse. Apart from, right, the history, throwing in some of the fancier statistics, that's what we found. Okay. All right, so that is what we did. I hope it's at least somewhat convincing. So where do we go from here? So, skyscraper curse. Should we be worried? Well, let me introduce you to the Jeddah Tower. The Jeddah Tower is causing me significant problems as somebody who likes the skyscraper. Well, I don't enjoy the skyscraper curse, but likes the concept of the skyscraper curse and its usefulness. So the Jeddah Tower was previously known as the Kingdom Tower when it first started construction. The plan for it is supposed to be 1 kilometer tall. Right? So that is in fact a record. It turns out. It's an enormous, enormous building. The construction started on it in April 2013. Notice I said started on it in April 2013. Right, well, then roughly 5 years later, they're building this enormous building. February 2018, they announced they thought they were going to complete it in 2020. Right, things are looking good. But 1 month later, right, so February, they say, yeah, we're going to be done in 2020. March, they have significant problems with the construction process. The Saudi Arabian purge happened around that time, which created all kinds of labor issues, right, with the contractor. So you see this delay that happens. So they kind of abandon building for a bit. And then they do eventually restart, but then they pause again, because what happens in the expected completion year of 2020? There's a pandemic going on, and that adds additional delays, right? So they shut down construction again for another 3 years, right, as the pandemic's going on. 2024 comes, right? So at this point, they've been building the thing for 11 years. Well, off and on, they've been building the thing for 11 years. They have to select new contractors, right, to try to continue the construction. Right, and they did pick it up again early of last year, 2025. So it is, in fact, actively being constructed, as far as I know, at this point in time. Right now, the tower has 100 floors. The plan is to eventually complete 167 floors. So it's a little bit over halfway done. Right? And right now, how well you can trust, right, these announced completion dates is perhaps questionable, but they are planning a completion in August of 2028. So I'm just saying you have about 2 years to prepare, right, at this point. So, although keep an eye on it, maybe they'll manage to delay the next recession. Don't take me too seriously on that front. Right? So, and that is, I want to give some kind of cautions, right, some qualifications about the skyscraper curse. Because there are certainly a number of false ways that we could interpret this. So one, it might be, say, from the zoning board perspective, right, you learn about the skyscraper curse. So this is terrible. We don't want to cause financial crises with building buildings too tall. Right? So what we need to do, right, is set limits on building height. So we're just going to have everybody get together at the UN, right? We'll talk about the skyscraper curse, say, all right, the Jeddah Tower, just stop. 100 is enough, right? We can ensure stability, financial stability, we just stop there, right? remember, we make no claim that building the skyscraper made the economy fall apart or something like that. No, it's a sign, right? It is a sign of the conditions, right, being such that we are moving toward the peak. We're making these enormous investments, malinvestments, right, that are indicative, right, of what the peak would be. Right, so we don't want to take this too literally, or we end up going down this nonsensical path. Another, I think, point that's worth making is that this indicator is not perfect. Right? Like, indicators are never totally perfect. Right? So we've missed some. Right? We have that false positive with the Woolworth building, for example. Right? The timing is also sometimes a bit fuzzy, like I mentioned before. Like when you look within a year, you're over half, but widen out a little bit more, and then you end up with more. So saying it's exactly 12 months or something like that, we can't be quite that precise. And so we do need to exercise some caution. We can predict the pattern, but not necessarily the details. Right? Another point that I would make is that it can help, right, to combine this with other indicators. Right? So we do have other indicators that seem to do reasonably well at recession prediction. So we have things like inverted yield curves, right, for example. I'd recommend talking to Paul Swick about this. I think he's our present expert, right, on the yield curve and inversions of the yield curve and connections, right, with Austrian business cycle theory. And so look for these things to align, right? If all the stars align, we're getting a stronger signal. Another thing we can look for, and this is something I hinted at before when I talked about Pittsburgh, is we can watch things like the Jeddah Tower. We can also watch clusters of building. Right? So when do we see, right, lots of buildings built around the same time that are all quite tall? And so I pulled up a little bit of data related to this as well. So I already mentioned Pittsburgh. So the dates that stood out there, certainly a lot in the early 1930s, onset of the Great Depression. Also, there were a number, I remember, from the early 1950s. I don't remember this, I looked it up as well. So I looked it up in Pittsburgh, a bunch from the early 1950s, which happened just before the mid-1950s. There was a recession as well. So it wasn't a major financial crisis. We saw that kind of recession occur. And then the early 1970s, just before stagflation hit us. The early 1980s, amidst the early 1980s recessions, right, as well, which were fairly sharp. And then 1987, there were a number of buildings being built in Pittsburgh in 1987. We know the stock market crashed in that year as well, even though the recession, they managed to push off the recession for a couple of years. So we see that kind of pattern here. I also looked, just because I wanted to say, let's look somewhere closer to where we are right here. Right, so if we look at Atlanta, here's the pattern of when buildings were built for the 125 tallest buildings, right? So we can see some patterns here. So we see a spike happening, again, right around that early to mid 70s, around the oil shock. Then also toward the late 80s into the early 90s. We get the 87 crash, the 1990-91 recession. Right? Then we have throughout the 2000s, right, leading into the financial crisis, right here. Right? And then we have here leading into about 2024. I'll leave that there. What about worldwide? So strangely, right, when you go to Wikipedia and you search world's tallest buildings, they give you a list of 98. Can they not find two more? But in any case, these strange numbers. But okay, so 98, the 98 world's tallest buildings. I did remove two of them here, but that's not what gave the 98. There's actually 96 that are on this graph. I did remove two of them because one of them is the Empire State Building, so we know that was 1930. That would push the graph, it would compress it, right, too much, because you'd have this one dot way up to the side, and then also the Willis Tower as well. So the Sears Tower in the 1970s. But all of the others, right, the other 96 were from 1990 and later. What kind of patterns do we see? Let's see, we do see this pattern right around, right, the time of the global financial crisis. We see kind of an increase compared to what was previous. Also, one thing that I'd point out, right here around 2012, that was also a significant year. It was kind of, in many ways, often overshadowed by the financial crisis that had just happened. But that's the Euro crisis happened right around then. Right, so all these things happening right after each other, so that we do see some signal here. We also have, again, this pattern right here directly before the pandemic, and also actually leading into it a little bit. Interesting thing about that, when you look at kind of this cluster right around the pandemic time, the majority, I think it is actually literally the majority, but at the very least a lot of these constructions were in China. So it feels like, to me in some way, the skyscraper curse was predicting there would be a pandemic coming out of China. I don't think it's actually true, right? But it's kind of it's an interesting connection. And then you come forward a little bit as well, and you see another spike here right around 2025 or so. And we'll leave it there. Thank you. 2 minutes.
I hate it because all my friends are losing jobs. I was furlough. I think especially in the U.S., trying to put so much into it. It's ridiculous. He knows exactly what they want. It's ridiculous.
Okay, everybody, welcome to this discussion on the economics of artificial intelligence, or AI. You know, I was talking to the other Dr. Klein earlier in the week about my talk on higher ed, and she said, "You're going to talk about the economics of higher education." She said, "I remember when, years ago, you, Peter, used to give a lecture on the economics of the internet. And at the time I thought, what does that even mean? There's just one economics, right, which you can apply to different areas, but there's not like an economics of education and an economics of the internet and an economics of this and an economics of that, which of course is exactly right. And that was a point emphasized by Mises and Rothbard, right, that economics has unfortunately become fragmented into these hyper-specialized areas with certain theories that only, apply in that area, when in fact we should think about economics as a much more general discipline, right? Which of course we can then apply to specific industries or countries or time periods. And that's exactly what I hope to do today, just as I hope I did yesterday, right? Remember, one of my key takeaways from yesterday was that education is not this magical, special kind of thing that is, immune to analysis using standard economics, but rather we can apply the lessons of Carl Menger and his successors, right, to analyzing the production and exchange and valuation and consumption of specific education-related goods and services. Okay, well, today's message is very similar, right? Yes, artificial intelligence as an abstract thing, and, comparing it to human intelligence and thinking about the singularity and when the robots take over and the Terminator scenarios and so forth are interesting to think about. But we can also analyze AI-related goods and services using standard economics, and that's mainly what I aim to do today. AI deserves a special deserves some time at Mises U because it's so important. Everybody's talking about it. You can find dozens of articles and blogs and videos and posts and so forth about AI is changing everything. I mean, I noticed that earlier in January, someone was telling us how AI will change everything. And then we've also been told that AI is currently changing everything. And then I found out AI has already changed everything. So I guess we've run the full gamut here of impact on AI. But kind of what I want to do, I mean, I'm sure many of you are intimately familiar with these tools and may have a lot of technical knowledge or practical knowledge about using various AI, various kinds of AI. But hopefully what I want to do is kind of demystify some of our beliefs and understanding of these tools and technologies and think about how we can address them and analyze them in a sort of a systematic way. So I'll talk a little bit about, what AI is, how to think about AI, how to characterize the phenomenon of AI, the AI industry and so forth, with a little bit of placing AI in a historical context, and then apply some Austrian economics, right, to the basics of valuation and production and exchange of AI-related goods and services. Talk about, firms that produce AI products. Talk about, call that the AI production sector. Talk about AI using or AI consuming sectors, right? What influence AI is having on non-AI firms and so forth. Talk a little bit about government intervention in the production and distribution of AI. So, pretty standard stuff. Let me remind you that, the concept of like an artificial thinking entity that is created by humans or maybe by the gods, right? I mean, that's not new. In fact, those of you who know the Odyssey and the original poem, right? A major location is the island of a group called the Phaeacians, where Odysseus is actually, that's the last place he visits before he goes home to Ithaca. In the Christopher Nolan movie, these people in this location is not included at all, but the Phaeacians were kind of a super advanced race that had a bunch of kind of intelligent machines, and the ship that actually takes Odysseus back to Ithaca is one of their ships, and it's almost like a automated, semi-intelligent kind of super ship that doesn't need a pilot, or it doesn't need anyone to steer it. It can steer itself. And the king of the Phaeacians is even described as having his palace guarded by 2 metallic dogs that can move, and they're like robot dogs. Okay, so the idea of an artificial person or machine or a thinking machine certainly goes back to antiquity. Some of you may know that the term robot was introduced in a play written by a Czech author called Karl Čapek in 1920. It's called RUR. And then a few years later in 1927, Fritz Lang's famous movie Metropolis introduced this robot character, and the C-3PO from Star Wars is loosely modeled on this gold metallic robot from Metropolis. So, even before sort of the age of modern AI, the idea of a thinking machine or an intelligent machine has been in mythology and in science fiction and so forth. Alan Turing published his famous article in 1950 on how we might different aspects of what we now call AI, including his introduction of the famous Turing test, right? So his criterion for a machine or an algorithm, a computer having intelligence is, if a human being interacting with that device or machine, like through a curtain or in another room, could not tell the difference between interacting with a machine and interacting with a person, then we can say that machine is as intelligent as a person. It has a kind of intelligence, right? What we now call sort of modern AI emerged a few years later in the 1950s. It was 1956, I think. There was a famous conference at Dartmouth College, now Dartmouth University, with some AI, cognitive science types and some economists like Herbert Simon and some computer science faculty, where they introduced most of the concepts and ideas that we associate with kind of modern AI. So from that time until just a few decades ago, most of AI was, I guess there were sort of 2 branches. One was what we call symbolic AI, which was like developing a formal symbolic language that would approximate the reasoning that a human brain does. So just like an old-fashioned computer program, writing computer code, if this, then do that. The idea was if we can represent human cognition in a series of explicit symbols and a kind of symbolic logic, then we can program a machine to emulate human thinking. But even at that time, it was recognized that actual human thinking is way more complicated than we can really understand. And there was another branch of what came to be known as neural network theory, which was trying to get computers to sort of teach themselves, get computers to experiment producing different kinds of output and then self-analyze that output and adjust the output without an underlying explicit model of what the thinking process is. And in fact, the AI that we have today, which the experts call narrow AI for reasons I'll mention in just a second, they're all kind of based on this neural network idea, right? Or what is sometimes called machine learning or sort of pattern recognition, right? So, ChatGPT is not responding to you the way an old-fashioned computer program would, right? It's not running through a series of explicit instructions. If I see this, then do that, right? It's rather a kind of self-emergent a process in which the algorithm is looking at patterns in large amounts of data and trying to extract regularities that it can use to sort of fill in holes in the data. Some people call it predictive analytics. I mean, what a large language model essentially does is, based on the series of words that I have seen up to now, predict what the next word is likely to be. Okay, now it's a lot fancier than that, the original kind of models of this type were very slow, but essentially they're running, those of you who know econometrics, running essentially a probit regression, right? Here's all the words that have come in the chat up to this point. What is the most likely next word that you should write? And it's essentially running a regression, a probabilistic regression with some randomness, right? And that's why it doesn't come up with exactly the same answer every time. If you ask the question to the prompt, you get a slightly different answer each time. So it's a next word predictor with some randomness. In fact, one of the first sort of large scale commercial application of this technology, before any of us knew the term LLM or ChatGPT or whatever, was when you're typing in Word or whatever and it corrects your spelling. Oh, in Google, oh, you typed "go," did you mean dog? Right, so spelling corrections in real time, that was the first application of this technology. Given what the person just typed, he probably meant to write dog, but he actually wrote something else, so I'm gonna put a little red squiggly underline under it to alert the user that maybe he or she typed the wrong word. So ChatGPT is a souped up version of that, right? Not to go into all the technical details, right? But when people came up with industry came up with what they call a transformer. Remember, a GPT, as you may know, stands for Generalized Pre-trained Transformer. So a transformer is a kind of technology where instead of doing this prediction like one word at a time, it can look at a long string of text and instantly all at once come up with a series of words that it predicts should be the next words. Right, that's why it happens so fast. And the way it works, again, the underlying logic is the same, but it works with these sort of massively powered databases. We'll talk about the data centers a little bit later and how much of the world's energy, is going to help you create fake images of robots reading Peter Klein books or whatever. But these transformers are trained on gazillions and gazillions of words and images and so forth, so that the algorithm can very quickly query that data set and do its sort of next word or next phrase or next sentence prediction, or do its image prediction almost instantaneously in real time. So that's what all these models are basically doing, right? Some people call this generative AI, because it's like generating new content. I type in a sentence and it gives me a new answer, but it's not really new. It's just dipping into its collection of words in the training data and then spitting out what it thinks are the next words that you want. It's not really creating anything truly novel. It's simply regurgitating, generating a sequence based on the information that it already has. We'll come back to that point a little bit later because it's a little bit subtle. Image generators are kind of the same thing. Writing computer code, again, essentially it's the same kind of process. The reason this is called narrow AI, the AI that we have today, is because nobody in the industry believes that the current generation of LLMs and image generators and so forth are equal to the capabilities of the human mind. But many people in the industry believe that's just around the corner. Right, so what they call AGI, or artificial general intelligence, could be an evolution of or an extension of LLM technology or this predictive analytics technology that is so good. Again, it's not qualitatively different, but the hardware is so fast, the training data sets are so large that essentially it is identical to human intellectual capabilities. And maybe even, it will exceed them at some point. And we'll have super intelligent artificial agents that are way smarter and way more creative and more entrepreneurial, et cetera, than human beings are. I personally am in the camp that believes that is not going to happen. It's sort of logically impossible for that to happen. I'll briefly touch on that a little bit, but that'll be some good food for discussion maybe later at the conference. Okay, so let's just do a little bit of basic economics here. Again, to repeat a point that I made yesterday in the context of education. People don't produce and exchange and value and consume AI as a sort of an abstract concept. Rather, we markets exchange and sometimes even what is exchanged on markets and sometimes produced by governments are specific AI-related goods and services, like a computer server. You know, NVIDIA is one of the companies, video game company, that is now the largest by revenue and assets, specialized AI firm, because it makes the chips, right, that most of the servers in the AI data centers are running on. Okay, but I mean, it's a computer company that makes hardware. It's no different. We wouldn't analyze it from a production theory or theory of the firm point of view any differently than we would analyze a shoe company or a car company or anything like that. You know, companies make software. Anthropic and OpenAI, you know, those are software companies. And we understand how software companies work, just like any other service-related industry. You know, sometimes these companies sell their services on a subscription basis. You pay so many dollars per month for, you know, Claude Pro or whatever. Okay, well, we understand how subscription service businesses work. There's nothing magical about these. Sometimes you're purchasing a device. You know, if you get a Tesla with full self-driving capability, well, you're buying the hardware, the computing and the cameras and all that, and you probably have to pay a monthly subscription fee to have the full self-driving capabilities enabled. But, you know, we can analyze Tesla as a company, or the profitability of producing certain Tesla models, or how much consumers are willing to pay for this capability versus that capability, exactly the same way that we would analyze any company that's producing valuable economic goods and services. In other words, the value to the consumer of a marginal unit of hardware or software or use of the vehicle or whatever is, you know, analyzed using subjective utility on a marginal basis. Law of diminishing marginal utility applies, and firms are producing using land, labor, and capital just as any kind of firm. Entrepreneurs are exercising judgment in trying to figure out what consumers will be willing to pay and introducing various AI-related goods and services into the market in anticipation of profitability and using economic calculation, blah, 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 blah. Okay, so everything that you learned this week about how markets work would apply to the AI producing sector in just sort of the standard way. Now, there are some interesting, you know, call them quirks, industry-specific features, some of the kinds of things that people started talking about a lot maybe 25, 30 years ago when the commercial internet first came into existence. There was a lot of talk about the new economy or the new economics, right? Of things like information goods. Well, when you subscribe to, you know, use a web browser or whatever, what you're really consuming is information rather than, you know, the utility you get from eating a hot dog. Okay, well, I touched on this a little bit yesterday. I mean, books are information goods, and we know a lot about books. A ChatGPT subscription is an information good, in that what you're paying for is information, but we know a lot about, you know, how those kinds of goods and services work. I mean, again, they have some interesting properties, like, you know, again, with a book, the cost to the author or the publisher is mainly in the creation of the content itself. You got to write the book, right? Once the book is written, the cost of producing one more copy of the book is typically small. You know, high fixed cost, low variable cost. That implies something for you, you know, neoclassical econ nerds, you know, about the shape of the average, long-run average cost curve and so forth, right? So there may be increasing returns to scale. There may be network effects, like the value of having this AI tool depends on how many other people are also using the same AI tool. So sometimes, you know, companies that can get into the market first can have a competitive advantage, right? So if you think about, if you have the basic subscription to most of the standard models, right, then you don't have the ability to exclude your chats from the training data from future chats. You probably know this, right? So that, you know, OpenAI's training data includes everything, every interaction that anyone using the free version has had with any edition of ChatGPT. If you subscribe to the pro versions, you can sometimes change the privacy settings where your documents will not be uploaded. By the way, you know, for us professors, you might say, well, how do we know if your essay was written by ChatGPT or by you when you turn in your college essay? Well, we have tools that we can use. We can upload your paper to an AI and say, do you think this paper was written by an AI? But at a lot of schools like mine, we are not allowed to upload your paper to the free version of Gemini, because that's, then your paper becomes part of the training data, and we consider that a violation of your privacy, right? That's a violation of the contractual agreement that you made when you enrolled at the university, right? But in cases where everyone's interaction with the tool becomes data for future improvements to the tool, there's a kind of a network effect. The more people who are using it, the better the product can be. So it's hard for a startup to enter today and have the full capabilities right off the bat of, ChatGPT or Claude or Gemini, if using the same technology that those products use. They already have a head start because they have this massive amount of training data from prior interaction with the devices, okay? But again, we've been talking about this for decades. In fact, I used to give this talk many years ago at Mises U on economics of the internet, or the new economy, so-called. In the late 90s, early 2000s, there was a whole genre of literature on this. A new economy with new rules. The advent of Wikipedia led for these people to come up with this concept of wikinomics, like economics is different in a world where it's like crowdsourced and open source and all that collaborative. The power of the crowd is driving the future of business. I mean, a lot of this stuff is just people trying to sell books, right? And you see the same thing today. I mean, one of the big, Sam Altman and what's his face at Anthropic, they give these speeches where they say, well, an entrepreneur, we already know that you can have a one-person firm, just an entrepreneur and some tech tools, but thanks to our LLMs, right, an entrepreneur running a one-person firm, that firm could become $1 billion company thanks to AI tools. So we'll be seeing these one-person billion-dollar companies any day now. Well, haven't seen them yet. But again, decades passed when all this new economy stuff was floating around. There was a great article in the New York Times by Hal Varian, making the simple point. He said, if there's a new economy, why wasn't there a new economics? And he's talking about one of the issues back then was like, will firms become smaller and flatter and everything will be outsourced and we won't have large companies anymore. And of course, the internet era brought us even more large companies and some larger companies like Microsoft and Google and so forth, or Alphabet, than we had seen before. And in this article, he says, if you go back to the classic literature, he's referencing Coase's 1937 paper on the theory of the firm, a paper that was admired by Rothbard, by the way, that the insights from that decades-old article on what determined, how transaction costs affect firm boundaries and all that, that logic still applies just as much at that time in the internet era as it did in the, in Henry Ford's era or whatever. So we don't need any new economic theories to explain AI. That's my point. What can we say about the sector or industry of AI producing goods? Well, you got a lot of really big companies, right? Some of the big tech, Microsoft, Alphabet, Amazon, Meta, and so forth. They're big players in this industry. These are still small companies relative to the largest companies in the world, like Walmart or ExxonMobil or Amazon, okay, or the full Amazon, but they're big companies. NVIDIA is the largest of these kind of incumbent AI firms. Then you've got some new entrants, or, AI-only companies like Anthropic and OpenAI that are quite large, but not in the same category as the giants. Well, what do they produce? Well, if we exclude hardware for the moment and focus on the software side, they produce models, AI models, okay? And, what they sometimes call sort of like the frontier models, right? Like the core models on which, that are kind of the primary models, the engines that are doing the interaction and the reasoning and the image generation and so forth. There's really not that many of them. right? There's, a small set of big players. There's GPT from OpenAI, Claude from Anthropic, Gemini from Google. Kimi is a new one from a Chinese company, just made a big splash a couple of weeks ago by introducing a new model that beat all of these other models in solving math problems. And most people hadn't heard of it before. Grok, of course, produced by X. These are sometimes called closed weight models, meaning the underlying algorithm and code are proprietary. But one of the interesting developments just in the last couple of years is a number of firms, especially DeepSeek in China, developed what they call, it's kind of like an open source or what they call an open weight model. And DeepSeek made a big splash because in just a few months with very little capital compared to the incumbents, it developed an LLM that was essentially as good as the other LLMs already on the market. So these are kind of like decentralized open source models. You can run your own version of DeepSeek on your own computer and train it the way you want to weight different outcomes and different inputs the way that you like. Meta's own AI that is running Facebook and Instagram is also an open weight model of this source. And one of the interesting things about this industry is just how rapidly the players change. Like I said, no one had heard of Kimi until about 2 weeks ago. And now Kimi is considered one of the frontier models. There's some others in Europe that have some government support and are performing about as well as you would expect. There's also, what some people call connectors or wrappers, like software that runs on top of a model. Like, do any of you guys use Copilot? Copilot is built into Microsoft products. Copilot is not a model itself. If you can type stuff into Copilot and get responses, or it can do stuff in Excel and Word for you, but it's running on OpenAI's model. Right, so it's licensing the model from one of these other companies. Or my university uses Box for document storage and retrieval. Box has something called Box AI. You can interact with a document, but then that's just like a wrapper that then connects you to Claude, some version of Claude or GPT that's doing the actual analysis. Even those of you, if you have the new Apple intelligence features, the new version of Siri on your iPhone, that has a little, what I'm talking about, it can summarize your emails and can do a bunch of stuff for you. Apple has not developed its own AI model. Siri is using, ironically, Gemini from one of Apple's biggest competitors as the underlying technology that Siri is using. So there are lots of different ways that companies can try to make money, can try to generate profits by producing various versions of products, in this sector. And, there's some interesting things about the strategies that entrepreneurs are using and are experimenting with to be successful. There's a lot of, sort of like two-level or two-part pricing. Anybody can use the free version, but they're giving away the basic version for free to get you hooked on it. So then you'll be willing to pay a subscription fee for the advanced version. And one of the interesting things that insiders tell us is, if you have one of the advanced versions, one of the paid versions, as a lot of you know, you get a certain amount of capacity that you can use. They call it tokens. Like you have a certain number of tokens per month. And if you use like the fanciest, Claude's version is called Fable, right? It uses your tokens more quickly. If you use the fancy version, it uses more computing power and use more of your tokens. Actually, the word on the street is these subscriptions are being offered, especially to corporate clients, at heavily discounted rates to diffuse these systems widely throughout companies, but eventually those rates are going to go way up. That essentially you're getting subsidized by paying a low month, $10 a month. You're paying $10 a month for something that is really costing the company $20 a month, and eventually you'll be asked to pay 20 or 30 or 40 or 50. By that point, you won't be able to refuse because you'll be so dependent on using these models for what you do. So in other words, the AI budget for companies that use AI tools is probably going to ratchet up a lot in the near future. And, for this reason, it's not exactly clear what the cost structure is. Like it used to be said for, other kind of internet software companies, this high fixed cost, low variable cost. Once you've written the product, you can, almost thousands and thousands of people can use it, and it doesn't really add to the incremental cost of the producer. That's probably not true for AI models because, the data centers are so expensive. The amount of computing power necessary to generate the data used to make the predictions and so forth, it's not necessarily getting cheaper as we do it more, right? It may actually, the cost curve may actually be going up instead of down with increasing intensity of use. So it's not clear how that's going to sort of play out over time. And of course, energy is a major physical constraint. And there are some theorists in this space, some analysts who say, we will never get the AGI or the super intelligent machines, not because it's technically impossible, but because, the Earth doesn't have that, the solar system doesn't have that much energy. If we devoted 100% of all, solar and fossil fuels and nuclear energy to running the data centers, we'll run out of energy before we can make it complex enough to have artificial general intelligence. Other thing to note is that the, established players in this sector are already extremely active in trying to use the state to give them an advantage over their rivals, right? You've heard of these, what they call the raising rivals costs argument in regulation. Anthropic and OpenAI are very open about lobbying in favor of strict government regulation on AI use, not because they love regulation per se, but because they think that will harm potential entrants more than it will harm them. There was a thing just a couple of days ago where the chief lobbyist for OpenAI wrote about it sounded like he said, I hope the Trump administration will slap huge tariffs and restrictions on Chinese AI companies, for national security. Like, dude, come on, that's so transparent. Of course you don't want to compete with them, just like US car makers don't want to compete with Chinese EVs because they'd get slaughtered, right, in the marketplace, not because of the Chinese stealing our secrets or whatever. Okay, what about the use of AI? What about the AI using sector? Well, it's basically the whole economy, right? It's useful in this sense to think of AI, goods and services, as tools. Okay, just like I use a wrench, to pick something or repair something or make something, I use ChatGPT or whatever as a tool. It's a capital good or an intermediate good or service, right, that allows me to accomplish some other objective that I have. Now, you often hear people say, well, yeah, of course AI is a tool or a technology, but it's a particular type, what they call a general purpose technology, confusingly also abbreviated as GPT. So the acronym GPT appears in two different ways in these conversations. Economists talk about general purpose technologies. In other words, it's not a tool that you can only use to fix this kind of machine. It's a tool that you can use to do almost anything. Well, but of course, we have a lot of experience with general purpose technologies like, the steam engine or electricity or industrialization and miniaturization and standardization, the use of the assembly line, computers, internet, right? So we already have a lot of experience analyzing general purpose technologies and how they might differ from more specialized capital goods. And of course, if you read Man, Economy, and State, there are many, many chapters on, specific versus non-specific factors of production and how they're priced and so forth. So, an AI tool is a relatively non-specific factor of production, and we can analyze how it's priced and used and so forth, just like we can analyze other less specific factors of production. But of course, the big issue that many people ask is, will the machines take our jobs? Right? Is there any role for human labor once AI and robotics, can do everything that human beings can do and more? Well, economists sometimes distinguish between what they call a labor augmenting technology and a labor displacing technology. So some kinds of technologies do displace some specific kinds of labor. If you've ever watched an old black and white movie, somebody gets on an elevator and there's a little guy there operating some levers or whatever to make the elevator go up and down. They used to have elevator operators. Okay, well, once automatic push-button elevators were invented, there was no need for elevator operators. You don't need a telephone operator to move a bunch of wires around physically to connect your call. So yeah, I mean, certain specific jobs and tasks are often displaced with the introduction of automated, industrialized, alternatives. But then that can also create increased demand for other kinds of labor. Again, somebody's got to build the elevator and the automatic elevator and service the elevator and come up with the next generation and so forth. So all of the people employed by AI companies, right? That's employment we otherwise wouldn't have had in that role. Okay, and remember, Mises himself emphasizes that the reason for increases in the standard of living or increases in economic productivity that ultimately comes from having more and better capital investment, higher quality capital, more capital invested per worker. Well, in that sense, we should welcome any technology that improves the productivity of labor. Just as a worker with a combine harvester can harvest more wheat than a worker with a hoe and a hand tool can harvest wheat. That increases the value of that labor. Likewise, a worker with AI tools can produce more output than a worker without AI tools. That increases the marginal product of labor. That increases wages for the workers who can now use these technologies. So of course, it's going to have different effects on different part of the labor market, but there's no reason to think AI any more than the internet or computers or electricity or the steam engine or the Industrial Revolution would cause mass unemployment, right? There's no reason to think that at all. In fact, we would think, on the whole, having these tools will make many kinds of labor more valuable than they were before, and entrepreneurs will invent a lot of new jobs and tasks that we can't even think of today. And of course, the purpose of economic we don't say that the benefit of a market economy is primarily the jobs that it provides, right? It's the consumption that it provides to consumers that we ultimately care about. If you want to read some contemporary works on the economics of AI, two books that I recommend by Ajay Agrawal, Josh Gans, and Avi Goldfarb. Sorry, I said Gans at all, it should be Agrawal et al. They wrote a book in 2018 called Prediction Machines that I think is pretty good. And then they have a 2022 book called Power and Prediction, where essentially they say that modern AI is essentially a technology of prediction. As I mentioned before, right, in the context of like predicting the next word. So predicting the next word, predicting what the image should look like, or for a self-driving car, predicting what the car in front of you will do and predicting when the light will turn red and predicting whether that pedestrian will walk across the street. That's what a self-driving vehicle is essentially doing. And so they say, look, with any other input, if that input becomes less expensive, firms will use more of it. Okay, so as prediction becomes cheaper, we would expect firms to invest more, to do more activities that benefit from prediction, and firms to reorganize themselves in ways to take advantage of this increasingly cheap prediction tool. Just like when we went from the steam engine, to electricity, firms didn't just keep doing exactly the same things they did before, but now using electricity instead of steam power. No, they greatly increased the amount of automated processes that they used at all, because now they had a much less expensive energy source than the energy source that came before. So we should be thinking about ways that entrepreneurs and firms will change what they do now that they have this inexpensive prediction technology available to them. Now, it also suggests that other inputs that are complementary to prediction, like human judgment, assessing whether the prediction is good or not, deciding whether to take action based on the prediction, those should become even more valuable and should, earn higher wages and so forth. Of course, this is going to vary by industry. Industries like insurance and, self-driving vehicles where prediction is core to the business, we would expect those industries to expand. Other industries that are less dependent on prediction might contract. And these changes will take time because you have to have a bunch of other complementary aspects of the system that will adjust at the same time. Now, they don't really distinguish in this literature between probabilistic risk and Knightian uncertainty and judgment in the Misesian sense. So I think that's a potential weakness. But I think there's a lot of good points are made on, let's apply standard economic reasoning to thinking about impacts of AI. That's why this is an example of how you can use off-the-shelf economics to understand this kind of radical phenomenon. Now, one concern that you often hear expressed is, well, if AI is going to substitute for some lower level cognitive tasks, right? Entry-level spreadsheet work that people used to do in accounting can now be done by an AI. So accountants, skilled accountants or human accountants will specialize in the higher level functions, the more managerial functions, evaluating the spreadsheets and dealing with clients and exercising tacit judgment and so forth. But one concern is, well, how do people become an experienced accountant with the ability to understand all the nuance? Well, historically, it's because they worked their way up. They started as an entry-level accountant doing grunt work, and only by doing a lot of the grunt work did they develop this higher level judgment. Well, if now you graduate from college and there's no grunt work to be done because AI is doing it, your only choice is to try to slot into a higher level position, but you don't have any experience. You don't know anything about doing accounting. So will there be a shortage in the future of capabilities in exercising executive level functioning, given if we outsource a lot of the introductory level functioning to AIs? I don't know the answer to that. I mean, one hypothesis is that a lot of this entry level work will become like long division. Like nobody knows how to do it anymore, but that's fine. You don't need to do it. You just you do it on your watch or on your calculator. Or other skills like driving a stick shift. How many of you can drive a stick shift? Oh, that's good. Okay, but you guys are Austrians, right? You're kind of malcontents, but most people your age cannot drive a stick shift, but not many cars have a stick shift, so it's really not a big deal. What about driving per se? If all you've ever been in is a Waymo, but Waymos are everywhere, is it a bad thing that you don't know how to drive? So it's an open question whether the loss of some basic skills is going to have a negative societal or economic impact. Maybe it will, as in this question of accounting, but maybe it won't. Okay, last thing before we break up, because I know people are going to ask me about this. Okay, can AI engage in human action or action? Can AI act in Mises' sense, according to praxeology and what we know about AI? I mean, okay, if the criterion is can AI pass the Turing test, I think LLMs can easily pass the Turing test, right? I discovered there's a whole Reddit thread of people who have like an AI boyfriend or girlfriend discussing their relationship with the AI, and it's pretty weird. But my own view on this is that the Turing test is really not the right test, because of course we can make artificial things that are extremely realistic and hard to distinguish from the real thing. It's like, when the original Jurassic Park movie came out, I think it was 93, some of you old timers may remember. It was kind of a revelation to cinema goers, because for the first time ever, you had, through the use of CGI and clever puppetry and so forth, you had dinosaurs that looked real. The dinosaurs didn't look fake. It's like, oh my gosh, I can totally imagine that I'm in the park and a raptor is eating me or whatever. It's like so totally real. But dinosaurs aren't real today in 2026. I don't know if they were real in the past or not, but there are no actual T-Rexes walking around today. So it's like a magic trick, right? I mean, your mind is persuaded that, oh my gosh, there's a real T-Rex right there about to eat these people. But if you think about it, you realize, no, that of course it's fake, because those things don't really exist. It's like Star Wars nerds arguing about, which Yoda is more realistic, the puppet Yoda or the CGI Yoda. There is no Yoda. Okay? Yoda is made up. Like no matter how convincing and realistic the character, literally we know that it's a fake. It's a sleight of hand. It's a magic trick. And essentially, when you're interacting with an LLM and you think, oh my gosh, it's just like a human, it's better than a human, it would totally pass the Turing test, that's a magic trick, okay? That doesn't mean the LLM is human. I wrote an article a few years ago with some co-authors it was an entrepreneurship paper on entrepreneurial judgment. And we distinguished between what we called original judgment and derived judgment. So original judgment is the judgment that's held by the entrepreneur owner of a firm. But the entrepreneur can hire subordinates, workers, managers, consultants, and ask them to act creatively and do the kinds of things that an entrepreneur would do. But that's different from what the owner does, right? So the hired agent can exercise what you might call proximate control. I task you with solving this problem, go out on your own and figure out how to solve it. But that's different from the control that the owner has, the residual control, which includes whether to hire the agent and whether to pay attention to what the agent says, whether to accept the recommendation and so forth. I think that's a useful way to think about AI, right? So in the entrepreneurship space, there have been some interesting studies where they have like AIs write business plans and then enter a business plan competition. And sometimes the judges view the AI-generated business plans more favorably than the human-generated business plans, okay? There's even a couple of studies where they ask the AI to be like the investor and evaluate the business plans. And then they show that, well, the ones that are evaluated favorably by the AIs actually raise more money in the real capital markets and maybe perform better over time. So it sounds like you can have an AI, like a specialized, skilled agent who's really good at writing business plans or evaluating business plans. But the AI cannot decide whether to be an entrepreneur or not, whether to use an AI tool or not, whether to accept or reject the recommendation of the agent. In other words, the AI is a hired gun acting on behalf of the entrepreneur. That's qualitatively different from engaging in action in Mises' sense. Now, some of you are going to say, I always get pushback on this, oh, well, you're just talking about the basic models. But what about the higher level models, the reasoning models? Okay, what we call a reasoning model is the same thing. There's not like a reasoning chip that's different from the regular AI chip, right? What they call a reasoning model is just another LLM that like runs through multiple, think of it this way, you ask a question, the AI generates an answer, then it does it again and generates a second answer. And then it compares the two answers to see which one is best. Then it goes back and reads your original question one more time. And then it maybe runs through this on multiple rounds. But it's essentially doing the same thing, just it's taking its time and doing it repetitively. It's not cognitively doing something different. Now, I do have some thoughts on what cognition is. And we're out of time, so I'll save those for the sort of question period. I guess the last thing that I will do, is just sort of summarize my thoughts. I'll say for now, because this industry is changing so much. AI goods and services can be analyzed just like other economic goods and services. AI is like other general purpose technologies in that it needs a free market to thrive. AI has both labor displacing and labor augmenting effects. It may turn out to be bigger than electricity. It may turn out to be more revolutionary than the steam engine, but it may not. We don't really know at this point. And even though machines and algorithms can mimic many aspects of human action, really what they're doing is exercising something like what I call derived judgment, not original or primary judgment. And AI cannot be an entrepreneur, cannot perform economic calculation, et cetera, et cetera. So AI constitutes a tool. AI goods and services are tools. They're powerful tools. We don't know exactly what impacts they'll have in the future, but we do not need to be concerned that they replace the human mind and the human action that Austrian economics is all about. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Zach. I appreciate that. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. We have a big topic. We have an important topic. Yes, thank you for taking your seats for today's lecture on government intervention and inequality. I think you're going to find this a very applied lecture and an actionable lecture and something that does apply to you. So thank you for being here. Thank you for watching at home on the virtual Mises University. And most especially, I want to thank the donors that make this event and events like it possible and have been making it possible now for 40 years. It's our flagship program, and it's helped students along the way to find their careers and to better their own personal outlook onto their future, and really enabled them to inform themselves better about the world that they live in. And that is more true today than ever before. So thank you for being here. Thank you to the Mises Institute and its donors and supporters for all of us being here today. Now, the topic of inequality is, of course, one of the most important and vexing problems of society and civilization. As I spoke yesterday in my lecture on the precursors to Austrian economics, the original thinkers in the original advanced society like Greece, their moral philosophers were concerned about moral issues, and they delved into understanding the economy in order to become better informed about all those moral issues. And inequality, especially as we're going to be talking about it today, is one of those issues. Now, in the past, I've been lecturing on inequality for several years now, and each lecture is different, so you'll find different material as you go back into the archives. Some of those lectures concentrated on inequality, basic inequality, the fact that as the world exists today, everything out in there in the physical world is very unequal, in terms of the land and the mountains and the valleys and the water and the soil types and the weather and all that is certainly unequal, but also people, we ourselves are very unequal in all of the attributes that we bring to the picture physically and mentally, intellectually, skill-wise, and so forth. Are we young, dumb, and unskilled, or are we old, grumpy, and unhealthy? Are we better at things in certain areas and less well prepared and trained in other areas? So there's that basic inequality, and we go through all of the basic differences, the hardcore differences of how that creates different comparative advantages and how the market economy with exchange, with the division of labor, with specialization of labor, how that benefits us as an individual striving to get our comparative advantage and to improve our comparative advantage, but how that helps society, how that makes us more prosperous. And of course, you've seen that in other lectures here today, so I'm going to skip that very important part. I've also done lectures that concentrate on the statistical aspects of economic inequality, where we're talking about income and wealth and other measures of economic well-being, and how those measures, Gini coefficients, income distribution, the top 1%, the top 20% versus everybody else and so on, took a deep dive into those statistics and how primarily ways in which all of that can be misleading. So our friends on the left, most notably Thomas Piketty, who's famous now for writing several books, slanting all of the economic statistics to make it seem like the world is owned by one person and everybody else is starving, but also just general journalists who also pick and choose statistics that mislead us as to the state of economic inequality. And I've spent a great deal of time on this book, The Myth of American Inequality, which tries to find a balance and a more correct perspective statistically about income distribution as it stands in the United States. I actually helped in terms of the research and reviewing the manuscript of the chapters in this book, and it's very worthwhile. I would highly recommend anybody who wants to get an be in-depth informed about the topics and the issues because they relate to everything, including economic policy and macro policy, a lot of the issues that Professor Degner dealt with in terms of the family, all sorts of issues. But today, I'm going to be concentrating in on the topic of government intervention and economic inequality. And most notably here, I want to draw our attention to the rise of democratic socialism in the United States. Of course, Senator Bernie Sanders, Democratic socialist in the U.S. Senate, AOC, congressional seat, very powerful and influential in the House of Representatives. And then more recently, a series of, Mayor Mandami in New York City, and then victories in the council seats in New York, in local races, in Washington, D.C., the congressional seat, in Denver, Colorado, and elsewhere around the country. So there's a tick up in support for democratic socialism, which is part of the sort of Democrat Party coalition, which consists of, the hardcore middle of the road Democrats, which are shrinking, and then the progressive Democrats, who are the left Democrats, and even further to the left of that is the Democrat socialists, who usually want to invoke much more extensive rules and regulations, but also outright takeovers of institutions by the government from the private sector. Dr. Bill Anderson, who's here this week, just published an article on Mises Wire about that sort of thing. And so the Democrat socialists are the fringe aspect of the Democratic coalition. They're not widely liked by other Democrats because, of the specter of communism and all of that. So they like to downplay the fringe parties, just like the right and the Republicans like to downplay the fringe and get rid of fringe members of the Republican Party. But the truth is that if you do scratch a democratic socialist, you're going to find a communist trying to itch that scratch. They are basically the first step, as far as they're concerned, strategically towards dictatorship. So it doesn't really matter what they say or what their party platform is at the time. They ultimately do want to seek complete control over things. And that's essentially what F.A. Hayek's very influential best-selling book, The Road to Serfdom, was all about, is once you open the door, once you let these people into the political process, they may have or state limited goals in the economy, but ultimately they want to control the commanding heights of an economy, the commanding industries of an economy, and they'll just do a step-by-step process, putting forth various ideas, hoping that they'll pass and become integrated in society and grow the power base. And of course, what Hayek shows is that this growth of the government sector is ultimately going to take away your decision-making capacity over where you live, how you live, what you consume, where you work, and so on and so forth. Ultimately, it pushes in that direction and results in dictatorial powers, decision-making powers of the central authority over the individual. So that's ultimately, where we're going and what we're seeing with these victories. We're seeing this with the policies, which is very informative as to where this is coming from. Okay, why is democratic socialism rising up, and what policies do they want? Well, they want to take over various things, Occupy Wall Street. They want to take over and basically have wealth taxes on Wall Street and, do all sorts of things there, control everything. They're also focused on health care and health insurance. Of course, previous generations, including myself, have voted for increasing health benefits, regulations, restrictions, and controls, and have driven up the cost of health care enormously in America. And the same is true with higher education. We voted consistently for all sorts of subsidies, all sorts of grants, research money, student loans, student scholarships from the state, all sorts of things. And of course, all of these subsidies basically have only served to increase the cost of higher education slowly but surely over time. I mean, you think of subsidies as making things cheaper, but ultimately on an industry-wide basis, all of these subsidies raise the costs because you're adding less capable resources and you're straining the existing resources. So the cost of adding students drives up the overall cost and the overall price. You see parts of that coming to flower in Professor Peter Klein's lecture on higher education in crisis. It's in crisis for a lot of reasons, but underneath it all, it's the bloating of government money increasing the cost and decreasing the effectiveness of higher education. So not only is higher education costlier than ever in any calculation you want to try to put to paper, but the effectiveness, the quality of the output is also falling. So the democratic socialists are focusing in on the right areas. And their own personal audience, who are they trying to attract to democrat socialism, is largely, people from, you might say, the middle class, college-bound, people with above average high Qs, younger people who are facing the specter of what old fart generations like myself have put on the agenda, which is, in terms of the United States here, you can try to apply it to your own country, but the United States is $40 trillion in debt. It's money my generation has spent on itself and expects future generations to pay for. Social Security, which is now running red ink. Those are benefits that my generation and previous generations, we've voted for increased benefits over time from the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s and to the present day, more and more benefits paying the same amount. And we've drained the Social Security Trust Fund. And the prospects of the future is that there's going to be more retirees and fewer workers. So the older generations are expecting the younger generations to pay for their benefits. So this applies, and it makes sense as to where this movement is coming from. So Mayor Mamdani reacted to a quote from F.A. Hayek, who foresaw all of this, of course, in 1944 with the book The Road to Serfdom. Hayek said, if socialists understood economics, they wouldn't be socialists. Now, Hayek is referring specifically to the economics of a socialist economy and the fact that it doesn't work, it can't work, either in its pure form or in any kind of hybrid form. So Hayek was referring to the economics of the issue, and recently Mayor Mamdani reacted to that with a challenge saying, if these past months where Democrat socialists have won elections have shown us anything, is that socialists not only understand economics just as well as the capitalists who came before, but that we can solve their years of mismanagement through an embrace of our principles. Now, a lot of people have commented on that particular statement by the mayor. And I'm going to try to explain it, and I have, of course, the correct perspective. Of course, I'm the teacher, right? So what he's talking about is that Democrat socialists it has nothing to do with economics, it has nothing to do with management, it has something very specific to do with politics, that they put forth a policy agenda, a party platform that appeals and wins among the young voters in large urban areas. That's what they've done very correctly, and I would concur with that. You know, these problems that I just described are real. Young people aren't dumb, and they're reacting to that saying, yeah, the older generation has somehow screwed things up. They have somehow taken away a big chunk of the American dream moving forward. And so I'm going to try something different. Somebody who's going to fix higher education, somebody who's going to fix healthcare in the United States, and somebody who's going to fix retirement in the United States. And also, of course, the capitalists, my older fogey generations, we have screwed things up with Social Security, which is an obvious irrational policy and should have never been adopted in the first place, and the national debt, which is an anathema to the principles of the American Revolution, and nationalized health care, or our version of it with Medicare, Medicaid, government insurance, and so forth. The capitalists have indeed screwed things up in the United States. So that's the general perspective that I want to illustrate, and then also provide some Austrian economic analysis for why that is the case, why Hayek is right, and why Mamdani is right if you interpret some of the words like economics and management and capitalist. They're not the pure definition by any stretch of the imagination. So, the Austrian analysis of government intervention. I'm going to try to keep this as simple and straightforward as possible. The first thing is, and you've already seen this in so many different ways in so many of the previous lectures here this week, is that government intervention of any type, of any form, no matter where it occurs in the economy, if it's a local zoning regulation or a requirement for how many Band-Aids a hospital has to have on hand, or if it's the Federal Reserve, all of those interventions make us artificially poorer than we otherwise would be. So there is, that's what we've seen so far, is there's a general depressing effect on economic activity. It hurts our ability to achieve our comparative advantage. It hurts our ability to divide labor and to specialize in the production of various goods and services. It distorts land utilization and capital utilization. It hinders entrepreneurship, all sorts of things that ultimately make us poor, but it's very difficult to see all of that in action, especially with small rules and regulations. It's hard to see the effect. And even with big interventions, like adopting Social Security in the 1930s, well, you're not going to see the negative effects in any way from a policy like that for many, many years to come, okay? One of the things that you've already also seen is that government intervention does not achieve its ends. Okay, so if you look at the sort of public interested reasons why government gets involved in various things, there's always some sort of public interest that's meant to be served. The local zoning rules are designed to give us green space and breathable air and, a better looking neighborhood and, all sorts of things. It doesn't actually achieve those ends any more than adopting the Federal Reserve Act during the Progressive era made the value of our money more stable or stabilized the economy or provided, it did provide an elastic currency, but not in the way they were talking about. And as a matter of fact, of course, the value of currency in the United States is now been depreciated by about 99%. And the business cycle since the adoption of the Federal Reserve has been more unstable than it used to be. So if you look long and hard enough and study it analytically sufficiently, what you're going to find is that government interventions ultimately do not achieve their public-spirited ends as they promote those interventions. Now, what we're going to concentrate here today is on government intervention causing economic inequality. So not just reducing the size of the economic pie, or not just reducing the potential for economic growth, or not, you could look at it in terms of stymieing progress or improvements in the standard of living, but actually, in this case, it's how the pie gets cut up. Who's getting bigger slices of the pie? Who's getting smaller slices of the pie? In terms of that analogy of the economy being an apple pie, we definitely want to know if it's getting bigger or smaller, but we also want to know, most importantly, are the slices changing in size over time? Now, as an individual, we expect our slice to change over time. We expect our ability to eat pie to improve as we go from college into the workforce and as we go from low-paying jobs to high-paying jobs. So obviously, on an individual level, our pie size, our piece of the pie is going to change, but we're going to be looking at it in terms of categories in the economy and how that's changing. And of course, the fact that 1, 2, and 3 are giving us negative results means that there's often calls for even more intervention. They never couch it like, okay, these interventions didn't work, therefore we need to get rid of them. It's these interventions didn't work, so we need even more of it. So government intervention, there's a lot to this topic. Rothbard provides us with a topology where he breaks down and categorizes all the types of government intervention. That's worthy of further study on your part. We're not going to really go into that topology very much, but it's important to know that it exists and that it's very helpful. We are going to talk a little bit about just the number of interventions in the economy in the United States because we have a variety of different levels of intervention. We have the local level, where governments on the local level have all sorts of control over education, they have control over land use, they control the local police department, fire, zoning laws, health codes, just a variety of different levels just on the local level alone. And then, of course, at the state level, there's all sorts of bureaucracies, the legislature making rules and laws, the bureaucracies making rules and guidances. And then the federal level, there's enormous federal level inducing all sorts of restrictions into our economy. So, yeah, and then we have even international rule-making body and law-making body, especially in the area of environmental controls and restrictions. So the number of federal rules and restrictions, not counting taxes, exceeds more than 1 million. State level regulations alone, and again, this does not include rules, but just regulations, is over 7 million. State level licensing requirements, if you added up all of the licensing requirements of all the different specific professions by the states, it would be 2,700 different professional licenses with tens of thousands of individual, specific, unique barriers to entry into professions. There's, of course, also the state tax structures on income, corporate, sales, excise, etc. Local zoning requirements exceed 10 million distinct interventions in the economy. At the local level, there are also all kinds of business rules, regulations, and requirements, including a bunch of health rules and requirements and uncounted millions of micro interventions. At the local level, there are over 19,000 local sales tax jurisdiction. And I couldn't even count those up. I asked AI, and AI did not want to give me a number. They said, no, we can't actually do that. I stumped AI. So that was an accomplishment. It eventually prodded it over and over again, and it eventually gave me an estimate of over 20 million different government regulations, up to an estimated 30 million government regulations. So I was happy with that, and also happy that AI offered me something I'm going to quote to you. And it says, this is the consensus of economists. Quote, the cumulative burden is not just the sum of its parts. It forms a dense, quote, regulatory thicket, unquote, that acts as a major barrier to entry for new startups while established corporations with large legal departments are much better equipped to navigate them. Okay, that's exactly what I was looking for. And that's exactly what I want to get into here today. Now, the main Austrian analysis here in terms of income inequality is beyond all of what I've said so far, is that Austrians, in particular Murray Rothbard in his Man, Economy, and State, and elsewhere, would talk about the difference between specific factors and general factors. General factors of production apply to all factors of production. So land, you would be thinking about just average land out there that could be used for housing or businesses or farmland or whatever. Land that is not centrally located, like what Professor Engelhardt was talking about, not in that central business district where we kind of know where it's going to go. It's specific to high rises and businesses and so forth. So general average land is a general factor. Unskilled labor is a general economic factor. It refers to people with low general levels of skill, people who are capable of getting jobs in a variety of different industries and businesses and job descriptions. So that refers to a lot of people, basically. I'm probably not capable anymore, but at one time I could do a lot of different things pretty easily. From working in a pharmacy to working on construction, working in farming. I mean, I've done all sorts of food service. I've done all sorts of things. But as a PhD economist, that's specific labor, whereas all those other jobs are related to labor as a general factor. Savings is also savings or capital that can go anywhere. So you might want to think in terms of just your personal individual saving that you hold in a bank. That money could go into stocks, it could go into various investments. It could be used by the bank to make mortgages. So that savings of the average person is a general factor. And then with firms and entrepreneurs, we're looking at potential entrepreneurs like mom and pop startups, like small and new firms, firms that are the engine of job creation in an economy. So when you think of companies, the biggest corporations generally reach a peak and then they experience job loss over time, whereas new companies who come in generally add jobs for many years before they peak out and level off. So small companies, mom and pops, small firms are a place of job creation. Now, instead of that, general factors, let's look at specific factors. So with land, we would like to focus in on land that is particularly adept at one and only one or maybe one or two different things. So in the United States, we have tons of land, but land for growing cane sugar is actually in very limited supply. So it's only going to be in places like southern Louisiana and southern Florida that you can grow sugar cane for the production of sugar. Same is true with the central business district. That land is very limited and very specific. Specific labor, we're talking about highly skilled, very experienced people in advanced professions like doctors, in contrast to orderlies, with capital goods, Specific factors would be like a robot who puts tires on an automobile on an assembly line. So that's the only job it does. That's the only job it can do. Whereas a hammer can be used by a variety of different people for a variety of different applications. And then specific entrepreneurs are people already in the business. They're already incumbents. They have high-tech equipment. They have specialist workers. They're not the mom and pops. So what happens in government interventions, and why do some people win and some people lose? A lot of it comes down to, are they specific workers and factors, or are they general workers and factors? So if we look at a particular supply and demand situation in a free market economy with specific factors, we're going to see supply and demand and price. And with general factors, we're going to see supply and demand and price. With an intervention, it almost always decreases the supply or increases the demand for those specific factors. So if we put a prohibition on importing sugar, if we put a price floor on sugar, or if we license and limited the number of sugar producers, of course, that's going to increase the price of sugar, and it's going to increase the demand for land, the limited amount of specific land in the United States that can be used for sugar production. So that particular industry, those specific resources are going to get higher prices of the land, higher profits for the owner, higher wage rates for the workers, possibly, and higher returns to the people who make mechanical sugar planters and mechanical sugar harvesters. So you can see that in this case, and really in all other cases, it's going to have the effect of helping specific labor and other factors of production. They're going to benefit from government intervention, but it's also going to displace others from the productive, from that area, from that industry, from the production of that product. It's going to release resources from that industry, and those resources can no longer get what they used to get in sugar production in the free market. They're being essentially dumped into the economy as general factors of production. So they're going to have to find new jobs, new applications in other industries where there's no government intervention. So as you shift the supply of resources out of the benefited industry and you force them into unprotected, unintervened markets, they're going to have to compete with existing land, labor, capital, and so forth. So as you're forcing people out of protected industries, privileged industries, or subsidized industries, you're going to force them into as general, non-specific resources, and you're going to make them compete in industries which already had established prices. And so everybody over there, where there's no intervention, is going to get lower wages, lower returns on capital, lower returns on land, lower opportunities for entrepreneurship. So that's the general effect of government intervention. And then, we can see this in some of the examples that we've seen so far. In terms of healthcare, for example, healthcare is an industry that faces so many interventions that it's completely difficult to count. But doctors have privileges, licensing requirements that keeps out competitors. Now nurses have interventions which keep people out from competing as nurses. Hospitals have use requirements where if you want to set up a new hospital in an area, you have to get the permission of an existing hospital in order to compete. Pharmaceutical companies have patents on their drugs, so the prices of those things are higher. Machines, mechanical devices in healthcare also have patents, and so their prices are much higher as well. So you're just driving up the prices and the costs of everything in healthcare. And we're not going to look at the specific people who are released, but it's very easy to imagine that if everything is getting more expensive and higher wages, higher prices and so forth, that the ability to purchase healthcare services has gone completely beyond the average person's ability to pay for them. And the prices of these things, especially the insurance prices, have skyrocketed out of control. So you have small groups of people, doctors, hospitals, pharmaceutical companies, who get great benefits from all these government interventions. They're not necessarily happy people, but they have economic benefits. But the rest of us face incredibly high prices or incredibly high insurance rates. And insurance rates is one of the things that the Democratic Socialists are complaining about and what they want to fix for us. So, and then of course, if you do include government insurance, whether it's private tax-induced comprehensive insurance or Medicaid, Medicare, government-funded healthcare for employees, for military, for veterans, and so forth, what does that do? Well, it has a tendency in terms of a moral hazard that people on comprehensive health insurance tend not to take care of their health very well. They tend to not work on the margins of things that would maintain their health where they wouldn't need health insurance. And so that Americans not only pay more for health care than anybody else in the world, but they also have the worst health of anybody else in the world. And one of those results that rises to the surface is the problem of obesity in the United States, and the high rates of obesity and the high rates of other maladies that are associated with obesity, like heart disease and diabetes, problems with various internal organs, high blood pressure, and the list really goes on and on. So the overall combination of all the various subsidies, all the various protections, and government insurance and payments that make people less interested in their care in comparison to a free market situation where individuals would have to pay prices. Now, of course, they would be much lower prices in a free market, but they would have to pay prices that we would fully expect, as pretty much everybody does, that people take better care of their health. So this kind of thing explains a lot. I was hoping to spend a lot of time on the K-shaped economy and how the Federal Reserve has really engineered the problem of inequality at the macro level. So Professor Degner already did that. I'd be happy to address that question more on Saturday on the podcast. I've talked about it on my podcast and a lot of the interviews that I've done on other people's podcasts. But today, we've been focusing in on the microeconomic effects of all of the various government interventions in the economy. Thank you so much for your attention.